Hello, Dave. Welcome to the Life at Leyton podcast. How are you today?
Thank you, sir. Yeah, doing really well, thank you. Doing well.
Good, I am glad. Now, we are here to have a conversation about autism and neurodiversity. So, I think we should just jump right in. To kick us off today, do you want to share a bit about your personal experience with autism and neurodiversity and what's inspired you to speak more openly about it recently?
Yeah, sure. I think the first thing there is just to say that obviously anything I say is from my own personal experience, right? Everybody's going to experience things slightly differently and maybe have different traits that kind of come to the fore differently. So there'll be similarities and things maybe others might resonate with, but we're all different. Um, so for me, honestly, I think I probably had known since I was probably early to mid-teens that there was something different. There was a reason why I wasn't um, clicking in, let's say, with the world in the same way that my friends were at the time. Um, there's a comedian called Hannah Gadsby who talks about um, autism and the experience being a bit like being the only drunk person in a room full of sober people, or vice versa. There's just something that's preventing you from clicking into the same frequency. Um, and that kind of is a good description, I think, of why I knew something was different. Um, but I think for me, it took as long as it did to properly investigate it and, get the label officially. Um, because I sort of didn't feel like it was a huge detriment to my quality of life until I really started thinking about it. Um, and it was COVID that was the kind of real turning point. Um, going from quote unquote normality to relative silence during lockdown. Um, as horrible a period as that was, for me, it was weirdly a bit of an awakening when I realized, oh, this is what my brain feels like when it's not being bombarded by sensory overload and it can just exist freely in the world. And that made me go, okay, something's happened here. And then when we started kind of slowly getting back into that kind of normality again, um, it was harder than it used to be because I realized what things could be like. And that was what really drove me to go, no, I need to do something about this. And it took a few years, we're coming up to a year now since the official diagnosis.
So, as you say, you'd kind of come through that COVID period and then going back into what was new normality again once we resumed to normal life. And at that point, did you start pursuing going to get a diagnosis, or did you do a lot of research before you got to that point?
There was a lot of research. So if we think, I mean, when did the last lockdown end? It would have been some point in
21?
21, I think. And then I finally started the process of diagnosis about this time last year, so sort of April, May 2024. So I'd already done a little bit of research and through, professional training I've had in my job, I'd learned quite a lot about neurodiversity and started placing some of those labels onto myself. And I think it has to be said that self-diagnosis is valid. Waiting lists are so long for this kind of thing. It can be a year minimum if you go down the NHS route, which most people will. That self-diagnosis is the first part of the process, right? Because you then have to start almost living like you are to live fully, I suppose. Um, but for me, yeah, a lot of research to the extent that the first meeting I had with the doctor I'd chosen, because I was lucky enough to go down the private route, um, she said to me, first question was, tell me a bit about your knowledge of what research have you done? Uh, and she basically said in our post-diagnosis kind of review, the reason I ask that question first is because a neurotypical person will start maybe doing some research when they go, maybe that relates to me. And then they'll look into it for a little while and go, nope, not me, and move away. A neurodivergent person will just keep digging into that hole of research because everything they read, they can go, yep, 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 that's me. Maybe not so much, but definitely that bit. And that level of research and detail, we go into. Again, I'm generalizing, maybe not everyone's like this, but she said it's often a really kind of telltale sign that, yeah, this is probably a neurodivergent person that I was speaking to. So it's a bit of a trend, I think.
Yes, and since you've had your diagnosis, I know that you've been quite open about talking about that experience and talking
Mm.
about what that means and how that affects you at work. What's inspired you to speak more openly or speak openly about your autism?
It's a really good question because I really went back and forth on how vocal and visible I was going to be. I have an unhealthy obsession with LinkedIn, as anyone who knows me at Leyton probably has already figured out. And I talk about a lot of things on it, and it's been really helpful to me in my own career, really, and personal life. And I set out quite early on there to try and be the visibility I didn't have as a younger person or at the beginning of my career, both in terms of being a queer person and being a person with an invisible disability. I'm also type 1 diabetic. Um, and those things just, we don't talk about them maybe enough. And for some reason, going through the autism diagnosis process, I I wasn't certain how visible and loud I was going to be. And then it kind of struck me one day. It was like, well, what's the difference? If I try and be the visibility and the representation I didn't have two areas, then surely this is the same. Um, and I'm really glad I did because it's actually the same way as talking about LGBTQ issues and being diabetic or having an invisible illness had done. It's got me meeting and talking to other neurodivergent people who are, the same age as me in similar lines of work and also got diagnosed in their kind of mid late 30s. And we're all going through the same process, and I wouldn't have found them if I didn't. So it's not just about being visibility for other people, it's about finding that kind of peer network for yourself as well. So I'm really glad I have.
Yeah, I think that sometimes when you are maybe before you've got the confidence to talk openly or to maybe seek out those spaces for the safe spaces, sorry, within
Mm.
networks, even if that's not publicly, it can feel quite lonely. But it's like you're doing something to almost like build that community by talking and by reaching out, and I think there's a lot to be said for that as well.
Yeah, and it's especially as a neurodivergent person, it's a really difficult thing to do. Um, we're talking in stereotypes, but obviously autism is very focused often on social skills and anxiety and an inability to deal with small talk. And all of these things are true, right? They're generalizations, but they're true. So I think that makes it difficult to form that network otherwise. Whereas if you've got social media generally, and for me, LinkedIn, the tool where you're sort of not talking to anyone in particular, you're just kind of putting your voice out into the world, and then whoever chooses to respond can. And
Yeah.
I know the rules of that interaction. Whereas if I'm in any kind of unstructured social setting, I don't know the rules of that setting, and it becomes really clear very quickly that I'm at my depth. So it's finding the right place to be that and to find that network for yourself. That's helpful. But what I would also say is don't force yourself if it's uncomfortable. I think if I had there's a reason I've become more visible and loud about any of these issues as I've got older. And it's because that kind of sense of self that you develop the older you get, that kind of, it's a bit of a cliche, but you start caring less what other people think the older you get. If I was in my early mid 20s doing all this, I think I might have been a little bit more hesitant and a little bit more anxious of doing it. Whereas now I'm a bit kind of, no, this is going to help me. I'm doing this because I want to. I sort of don't care, which seems a little harsh, but it comes with that sense of self that you get as you get older, which is why that visibility and representation, whatever you're talking about, is so important. Because if that the younger version of you didn't have the confidence or the self-awareness to do it, then seeing someone else do it might have a similar impact.
Absolutely. So there are still a lot of misconceptions out there. What are some of the most common misunderstandings that you've come across, and how would you challenge them?
Oh, we could be here for a while on this one. Um, The single biggest misconception I think I personally hear about autism, and I will always call out, is this kind of idea that, oh, everyone's a little bit autistic, or oh, we're all a little bit like that, really. Like, no, really, really no. Um, it's if we think about it in terms of, let's say, social situations or sensory issues with kind of noises and smells and things like that, and an inability to focus when there's too much going on. Yes, everyone can feel like that. And maybe being in a busy office environment, for example, makes it difficult to focus on something. The difference for me is it debilitating? Are you just not able to focus because there's lots going on? And if you put yourself in a different environment, then suddenly you can focus. That's so draining that after that day of loads going on around you, you get home and you're immediately shut down. You're done. Like brain off. Can't cope with it. That's the difference to me. And I think this idea that everyone is a little bit autistic is really damaging because it's a spectrum, but it's not a spectrum of being a little bit autistic to being very autistic. Anyone who has that diagnosis is the same level of autistic, right? The difference is how different traits display themselves. So autism is a huge range of potential traits and behaviors. And I saw a really good analogy, I think it was on Instagram a while ago actually, of someone describing it a bit like a mixing desk, where you see, all of these different levers that push different things louder and quieter. And each one of those things, each one of those little sliders is a different trait. So some of them might be difficulty with eye contact, some of them might be ability, some of it might be has violent meltdowns. Um, and they're all at different levels for every single person, which is why it'll never present itself in the same way twice almost. And I think that misunderstanding of that spectrum is perhaps a cause of that everyone's a little bit kind of trope, which I think is damaging because it's the difference between things being a bit irritating and things being debilitating. It's why it's a disability.
Yeah, and I think I always try to assume positive intent, and I think that sometimes
Yeah.
people are trying to maybe make people feel like it's normalizing it a little bit, and they're maybe and it's not necessarily coming from a place of damage or hurt, but it's understanding that sometimes your intention behind a word isn't the most important thing. It's how it's perceived by the people who maybe
Yeah,
are upset by that or who are impacted by that.
I think that's true. I'm the same. I never try and assume malice where it
Mhm.
potentially is just ignorance, and I don't mean ignorance in a deliberate kind of um, insulting way. I just mean they don't know. And you don't know what you don't know, right? I think sometimes our reaction to new information or being challenged on something is overly defensive rather than, oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that. Um, so it's, yeah, you're absolutely right. But I think that's why talking about these things is equally important because that perception is often more powerful than the reality, like you say.
Definitely. So I guess there's also that little space where there maybe are people who are toying with the idea that they're identifying they could be neurodivergent in some way. So, like you said, that
Mm.
you kind of had a feeling that things were different and you'd felt differently. Um, so for someone in that position who's maybe listening to this now and is a bit nervous to say, "Oh, I'm maybe a little bit autistic" or something, like what's the best way for them to navigate? I guess that period where they're discussing a diagnosis or going through
Mm.
that investigation period.
There's lots of ways to go about it, I suppose. I think finding a source of information you trust is really, really important. And I think as much as it has its problems, social media can be really, really powerful for that. So for example, women are hugely underdiagnosed with all types of neurodiversity, but autism in particular. And there's a lot of people who use Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, whatever it might be, to talk about their journeys to hopefully help other people recognize that that's me too. It's a safe thing to go and investigate. I strangely found myself resonating with a lot of the stories on social media from women who've been diagnosed as adults, more so than men. I don't know why that is. I think it's maybe some of my high masking traits were quite similar. Um, but yeah, find information that you trust. Find people that maybe you see you have something in common with and you can see yourself in, because that helps everything feel a little less different and a little less scary. And if you can find a bit of a community, it could just be one person, um, that you're safe to kind of talk to, then do it. It's kind of scary at first, but we're at this phase. I think there's a bit of pressure, and I think one of the challenges at the moment is when you see lots of talk in the media and by certain politicians about
Mhm.
how, everyone's suddenly autistic, everyone suddenly has ADHD, we've got to stop this. That makes it really difficult for someone who's in that situation of thinking they are and wanting to find out more, because it feels like, am I? Is this just a trend? The analogy I would always point people towards there is there's a famous graph of the rise of left-handedness, um, through the middle part of the 20th century, where suddenly we didn't think it was a sign of the devil anymore. The number of people who were openly left-handed skyrocketed, and then it leveled by the time we got to the 70s, because all that happened is people who were always left-handed felt safe to say so. And we're in that period now, with things like autism and ADHD, where those of us that grew up in the 80s and 90s, where it was starting to be spoken about, but it was the kid in school who had massive meltdowns and threw chairs at the teacher. It was that stereotype. It didn't have any other kind of nuances. Are starting to realize that no, we have been all along, and the conversation is being had more in public now, and therefore more people feel safe to talk about it. It's the same reason why the average age at which people come out as gay or bi or trans reducing, uh, until maybe the last few years, we've made that space safer to do so. Um, all of these things are the same. We kind of, when the environment feels safe, people start to become visible. And it's not that it's suddenly a trend, it's that we've created a space that they feel like they can talk about a thing that always existed. So find that space that you feel is safe, is what I would say at the end of that semi-rant.
No, no, that was perfect. I actually want you to cover off one thing that I had said wrong to you in a previous conversation as we were running up to this
Okay.
podcast. So I had talked about Asperger's, and you quite correctly corrected me that that's no longer a term, and that was again assumed positive intent. With no harm was meant by that. That was
Yeah,
a term that was spoken a lot when I was at school. So do you maybe want to talk about how that's maybe no longer an appropriate comment to make?
I can. I mean, honestly, I'm not an expert in why that terminology has changed.
Mm.
But I think Asperger's was a term often associated with people on the autism spectrum who displayed more awkwardness and things around social interactions, not being able to see visual cues and read people's faces, as opposed to those more stereotypical signs of autism that I've already mentioned, the kind of the meltdowns and the shutdowns. Whereas now we really see it as part of the same spectrum. It's why autism is often now referred to as ASD, autism spectrum disorder, and it's all part of that kind of umbrella. Essentially, there are still people, and I've spoken to them, who use the term Asperger's, who were probably diagnosed with Asperger's, before that language shift. And it's whatever you feel comfortable with. For me, I've come across people saying, no, it's a person with autism, not an autistic person. It's not the sole trait, isn't they're not all that. Um, and some people get very, very, um, the reactions are quite kind of intense with using the right language. Personally, I sort of couldn't care less. If you're using language you feel comfortable with, then use it. But I think the Asperger's thing stems from a change in the kind of medical outlook that this is part of the autism spectrum disorder rather than something different.
No, that makes complete sense because I think does go down to that spectrum as you've talked about because I think there has been a better understanding of how to explain the spectrum to people now. You talked
Yeah.
about a visual with the DJ mixing board, and I'd seen one actually yesterday on Instagram that was almost like a color wheel. in the same sort of way that, different parts of the colour wheel
Yeah,
were more vivid.
yeah.
So I think that's a
Everyone's
much, yeah.
Yeah, everyone's a bit different on it. I think if my parents, for example, had sought out a diagnosis when I was younger, and they talked about it, they've told me about this, since I might have been seen Asperger's side than the autism side at that point in the what would have been mid to late 90s. Um, but knowing more about it as I do, the things that cause those big meltdowns or those really dramatic shutdowns in really high support need autistic people do exist in me. They're just quieter. I don't have meltdowns where I'm throwing a rage and become violent or whatever it might be. I have shutdowns. When things become too much, my brain just switches off and my normal Dave talks too much becomes complete silence. Um, and that's something that I think is ignored sometimes in that traditional Asperger's diagnosis, where it's all about social anxiety and awkwardness and not being able to read those cues. That exists too, but I think that's at the detriment to some of the more stereotypical autistic traits that exist in those people too.
Thank you for explaining that. That's really helpful. And the last thing I want to touch on before we move on to the next question, because I am keen to move on, but is you mentioned masking. So do you want to maybe just give a really high level understanding of what that is for our listeners?
Yeah, so every autistic person has a different level of ability to mask. And masking basically means hiding those traits that make you feel different or stand out in the world. So where you have someone with high support needs as an autistic person, they aren't able to mask. There's certain parts of their autistic spectrum, those traits that demonstrate themselves so strongly that they stand out. They are clearly, I hate the word, but different to the neurotypical world that we live in. Your ability to mask is basically it's about blending in. It's about someone who's a very high masking autistic person who will reveal at work, for example, they're autistic, and everyone will go, I'd never have guessed. That's because they've been pretending, they've been acting, essentially. And imagine, feeling really uncomfortable in an environment and putting on those airs and graces. Like maybe you've got a family member visiting that you just don't like, but you have to be really nice to them, and they're just there for a couple of hours. Think how exhausting that can feel, and then do that 24 hours a day. And that might be a bad analogy because there's a whole lot of other things involved, but it's maybe the most neurotypical thing I can think of that can kind of make people understand what that's like, I suppose. Um, it's quietening all of those tendencies. It's a thing that I do a lot is try and really, really silence my reactions to sensory overload. So if I'm visiting the London office, for example, I can have very, very different reactions to that busy environment, and I don't know which one I'm going to get until I get there. So sometimes when I leave that office and I wander up to Fleet Street and there's buses and taxis and people everywhere, that creates this weird white noise that I find quite relaxing almost. It's like a stimming, it's like a stimulation, weirdly. Other times I can be standing at the traffic lights waiting to cross the road and a bus goes past and it almost physically hurts, but I might be standing next to somebody who I work with, um, and they don't know that's just happened to me. I've kept that in. And I might have gone silent for a second as I kind of readjust and bring myself back up to be able to talk to them. But it's happened, and it can happen the flick of a switch. It can happen multiple times a day. And that's all day, every day. It can be the lighting in an office. It can be, I think last week, for example, we had this weird weather in Scotland where it was really, really sunny and really, really windy. And I was walking my dog after work just as the April was low enough to be right at eye level and walking into bright sun with the wind as well, my dog pulling to sniff everything. It's all too much and my brain starts to shut down. Um, by myself, I've got no choice but to just keep going and then fall asleep on the couch when I get home. If there's someone else there, there's this weird kind of almost like we feel we have to put on those airs and graces. We have to mask because we are with somebody else. They can't see that. And that's masking. And everyone has different levels of ability to do that. But we all, as a neurodivergent community, do it. And it's one of the major causes of anxiety, depression, and exhaustion and burnout in anyone who's neurodivergent. Because imagine having to do that all day, every day, because the world isn't designed for the way your brain works. It's a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that it's um it's something that's probably hard to understand for people who are neurotypical, but I
Mm.
think it's really important to understand that people around you who are neurodivergent are probably experiencing this on some occasion every day in some
Yeah.
way whilst you're around. So this does lead really nicely onto my next question, which was talking about bringing it back into the workplace. So when it comes to the workplace, how can autism show up in ways that some people might not always recognise? And what can leaders or colleagues do to make things easier or more inclusive for everyone?
It's a really big question, and we'll not be able to cover kind of everything today. But there's a few things I think that are really important. You know, as someone who works in the world of sales enablement, so training, coaching, all these things, I have a bit of a mantra that is nothing you do to make something more accessible for a minority will make it less accessible for the majority. I, excuse me. Really, what I mean there is clarity. You know, if you're displaying information in a possible way, if you are explaining why rather than just telling. That's really important. It's a bit of a stereotype, but it's very true. There's this desire within the autistic brain to be able to comprehend why. If something seems strange, or if we think that's odd, surely this would be better. It's really difficult for our brain to get around that kind of, but why are we doing it this way? This way is better. And that can come out in the workplace as feeling a bit impertinent, as feeling a bit argumentative, especially if you're at a more junior level. I think back to my first job after university. I worked for a business insurance provider, um, and I was a nightmare. I'd proven that I was quite good at the job, but I hadn't earned the right to be as loud and vocal about the things I disliked yet. I was 21, I was 22, and I was unable at that point in my undiagnosed self to understand what was happening and why I was breaking some of these unwritten rules of the corporate world when I went to the person who was 3, 4 levels of management above me and said, "This is stupid, we should do it this way." I hadn't really figured out the right language to use, the nuances of that conversation, and kind of was a bit of a troublemaker as a result. Not in that stereotypical Dave misbehaves kind of way. I've always been a fan of the rule book, another autistic trait. But if the rules seem weird, we want to know why. And in the workplace, that can come across as a bit um, like we are not doing what we're told or we're being subordinate. Subordinate. It's a difficult one. So especially in someone who is undiagnosed or doesn't know themselves, that can be difficult to deal with as a manager if you see that. The other thing that can happen, and we may be seeing examples of it in this very conversation, is two things. One, really, really, really getting into detail. So if there is something we have an interest in as an autistic person, we are very likely to learn and research and delve into that topic in more detail than an average neurotypical person would. And what we're then going to do is give you all of that detail, whether you asked for it or not. Masking might prevent us from doing that to the extreme because we recognize we're doing it, but sometimes we don't. And occasionally I'm guilty of this. If I'm talking about a topic at work that I feel quite strongly about, or I find really, really interesting, that kind of transition out of that topic is really hard. I will just keep going until someone stops me. Um, and it's a bit of a love language doing that because I'm enjoying the conversation. I want you to see how much I find this interesting, and I want you to find it interesting too. Um, But in the workplace, that can often be seen as a, can we move on now? That's enough. Please stop. um, and that can be difficult, I think, to manage, especially if you're in a client-facing role, for example, where that's not a done thing to do on a conversation, let's say a sales call or a meeting or anything like that. If I think to my early sales career, there's a story I tell our induction groups every month, pretty much, which says I used to talk too much on sales calls because it was like all this information I just learned. I need to give them. They're the person that might buy this thing. I need to give them all the information they need. And then my manager came up behind me and wrote "Shut up, Dave" on a post-it note and stuck it to my laptop, and it stuck with me. But thinking back to what would have been 24, 25-year-old me, didn't know that's what I was doing. I was info dumping because I felt that was the right thing to do. It wasn't just I was talking too much. There was a reason behind it that I didn't know at the time. So yeah, there's loads of different things to go into there. But the real one, I think, in the workplace and for managers in particular is explain why. It can't just be tell. There's got to be reasoning, because if there isn't, we'll ask for it. And what so often happens in any part of life, when an autistic person asks for the why, we're met with a defensive or sometimes kind of almost confrontational response when someone thinks we're arguing. We're not. We just want clarity, because that's what our brains thrive on. And everyone thrives on clarity, right? So it's a good thing for everybody. But next time someone asks you why, think about that. Are they just seeking clarity or are they arguing? Because it's very likely the former.
Yeah, no, I think that that's such a good point to make. You've said that creating that safer space or that accessibility for people with neurodiversity, it benefits everyone. So just that why piece on its own, I can see really will make such a difference to everyone in the team. Is there anything else that people can do, whether it's colleagues or leaders, that can make the environment a bit more inclusive that does benefit the whole team?
Mhm. There's a few things I think other than just the simple why. So one of them is about the things we do to sort of bring our team together, raise morale, do a bit of team building. A lot of the activities and things that we might think of stereotypically in that environment, whether they be in the workplace or things we do outside of the workplace, socializing as a team, whatever, can be really daunting um, as an autistic person. The mere mention of company socials or team nights out or team building events, I can feel the anxiety in me grow as soon as someone says something like that. And it's not because I don't want to get to know my team better or I don't feel like people should be able to enjoy those things because I don't. It's not that. It's an inability to, it's just simply not understanding how to behave in that environment. If we're in that environment, it's going to be overwhelming for us. I think a recognition that there are different ways that we can build team morale, we can get to know each other better, we can have social events that don't always um, feel like they are leaving out some people. And I think the way that benefits more than just a neurodiverse person is if everything you do is around alcohol or around some kind of sport kind of related activity or any of these things that we find ourselves doing. It's not that that activity in itself is bad. Perfectly fine, go enjoy it, absolutely, but let's have some variety in that. Let's think about things that everyone can enjoy, whether they are autistic, whether they need to leave early because they've got childcare to worry about, whether they don't drink, whatever it might be. I think being a bit more inclusive with the way we build our teams and kind of build that kind of team atmosphere. Um, it does benefit everybody. It's not to say you can't do those stereotypical activities, go for it. But as long as you're doing something that brings other people into that as well, and the pressure of feeling like you have to say yes is really horrible. And from an autistic perspective, it's not that you might not enjoy the activity. It's what happens when the activity stops and it becomes unstructured. That's the terrifying bit. So it's, yeah, I think that level of inclusion is really, really important for everybody.
Definitely. And like like you've said, there's a lot of different reasons why that social activity might not be everyone's cup of tea. So I
Yeah,
think that that's a really, really good point to make, that that does impact everyone in the team for a multitude of different reasons. I think that's a really great example.
yeah, thanks. It's yeah, helps everybody. I think there's other small things we can talk about, which um it kind of transitions and scheduling. You know, the day of back-to-back meetings is not good for anybody. But when you are someone who is masking your way through those conversations, albeit being very good at your job, doing, you know, whatever you do well, everything around that is exhausting, and we need that space to decompress, to not mask for a while. And again, that benefits everybody because there's nothing worse than having a day of back-to-back meetings with no ability to switch your brain from one to the next almost. But recognizing that some of us need that space to decompress is really, really important, particularly for any neurodivergent person where transitions are difficult. So the example I would give is if I try and switch from training delivery mode into reporting on the last training I delivered, I can't force my brain to do it. I need to go and do else first. Even if it's as simple as go for a 5-10 minute walk. I need to do that to clear the previous activity out of my head because transitions are really hard. We get really stuck in the kind of the activity we've just been doing, whatever that might be. And I think those breaks again, hugely beneficial for everybody, but for particular reasons with a neurodivergent brain.
Yeah, fab. Um, I've not prepped you for this question, so it's maybe a wee bit of a curveball.
Scary.
So I am just listening to you talking, and I guess getting to understand how autism impacts you, and what how that presents itself to you. And I am so intrigued by your draw to a career in sales and your draw to a career in training. And it's
Yeah.
just purely interest. It's so interesting to me. And I guess it's led the question to me to almost ask myself, why am I being a bit assumptive that someone with autism who has certain, I guess, like you face challenges, you face things that are really debilitating, as you've said, through the day, if things have become overstimulating. What drew you to a career that puts you in situations where you're having to
Yeah.
transition, you're having to
It seems like a really
deal with
stupid
maybe
idea,
social
doesn't it?
situations? Yeah, so it's just very interesting to me, and it's me challenging my own perception of,
Yeah.
I guess, why you would want to put yourself in situations that might make yourself feel uncomfortable. You must
Yeah.
get a lot back from the career that you've
Yeah.
chosen.
It's weird. I've asked myself this very question so often. And some of it, you know, might stem from the fact that I got into this in my early 20s before I knew. And maybe in the back of my mind, I did know, but, you know, I was just looking for a job. I graduated at the point of the last recession. So, the global financial crisis. So jobs were hard to come by. And the first one I got was in sales. But yeah, it's a really interesting question. And I've racked my brain on this for a long time. And I actually I wish I could remember who it was, but when I was digging around in my pre-diagnosis research, I came across someone who was talking about how if you're a high autistic individual, which I think I probably am, people that know me really well, as soon as I said I'm going for a diagnosis, went, well, of course you are, Dave. But those who maybe only know me professionally or otherwise might find it surprising because I mask pretty well most of the time. And what she was describing was this idea that any highly masking autistic individual has made human behavior one of their special interests. So there's this stereotype of an autistic person having one or more special interests, things they're really obsessed about. Um, and I kind of heard this person on social media say that, and I was like, "You're absolutely right." There's a reason I studied sociology at university. I'm fascinated by human behavior and what works when, why, what are these rules? And I think it stems from the fact that all through my life I've had to figure them out because they're not intrinsic to the way my brain works. And sales is literally that. There's so much psychology and sociology into the sales process and the way people react to certain triggers and questions and everything about sales from a team perspective, I found really hard because sales, less so now, but certainly for the first 10 years of my career, was a very hyper masculine space to be in, and not just as an autistic person, but as a bi man, as someone who's very open about things about diversity and inclusion. I found that environment really difficult, not just from an autism perspective, but just feeling like I didn't fit in anyway. So that situation, I think, was really difficult through the early part of my career. Things have got a lot better since then, but the act of actually talking to a prospect or a client and building that kind of relationship, it's funny, sales is all about putting rules and process and patterns to those interactions and to those relationships, which doesn't exist when you're not in the office or you're not selling, you're just out in the world. So it's really weird, and I think it does sound weird to have got into a sales career as an autistic person for exactly the reasons you explained, but then about it, I'm like, sales is just about putting process and rules to human interactions and learning what works and what doesn't. And I can't think of anything more autistic than that, which is, I don't know, maybe that's just me trying to make myself feel comfortable about my life choices, but it sort of makes sense the more I think about it. There's a reason I'm not in sales anymore. I found it exhausting for all the reasons we've talked about, the ups and downs of it and things. And there's a reason I love training and coaching. And it's basically seeing those patterns and those rules and processes click in someone else's mind and them suddenly getting results because of it. I always got a bigger kind of rush from that than I did from closing my own deals. So that's why I've kind of moved over towards the enablement thing. But yeah, that's my justification for why I've spent 15 years in a career that feels a bit too social for my brain.
Not that you have to justify yourself to me at all, Dave. It was more just me listening to you and I guess really just challenging my own perception there, and I guess it makes complete sense when you explain it in that way around the patterns and the flows in the conversation, and you can follow and rely on that to guide a conversation, and that makes sense. And it just, I guess, highlights that every single person is completely different. Like there's no one person in any job that is the same as the person sitting next to them. They all come in with a spectrum of skills and experience and ability to handle the situations differently. So it does make complete sense. But that was my off the hand question to you. Sorry about that. Okay, fantastic, Dave. Thank you so much for this conversation. I feel like I've learned lots, and I'm sure everyone listening is going to feel the same way. Is there anything else that you wanted to cover that I didn't get a chance to ask you or I forgot to ask you? Any final words?
I suppose one final thing, if I'm on my pedestal to end, a minimum of about 70% of autistic people are unemployed. Now, some of that is out of necessity because their support needs are so high that maybe they wouldn't be able to hold down a job. I'm one of the lucky few that, maybe because I can mask highly, maybe because my loudest autistic traits aren't things that prevent me from being able to hold down a good job, and one that I'm very happy in. But there's a massive majority of our community that isn't being able to have that kind of sense of self and kind of purpose that having a career that you like can give you. And I think for any manager, for any recruiter, for anyone really that's got an open position, think about what can be done to maybe open up some of those roles. And I positive discrimination here. I just mean to make them more attainable to someone who may be more visibly autistic than I am. And that might be the wrong phrase to use, but it seems to be the most kind of obvious way to describe it, because that number's too high. So that's my little last piece of awareness for the day.
No, and I think it's a very fair call to action. We all know that the more diverse a team is, and that's in every sort of diversity, the more diverse a team is, the more productive it is, the more successful it is. And that's purely because you have diversity of thought. And I think it's you often you often find people who are vocally talking about their own neurodiversity on platforms like LinkedIn are incredibly great at what they do. They're fantastic at what they do, and they bring such a depth of knowledge and a different way of thinking. And the best ideas come from someone asking why do we do it that way and why don't we do
Yeah.
it this way? So I think that anyone who comes with an ability to think about things differently, and that is everyone, but especially people who are
Mhm.
neurodivergent, it can only strengthen a team by, making space for people within teams that, a safe space for them to be able to do their best work.
Yeah, totally agree. Totally agree.
Fantastic. All right. Thank you again, Dave. This has been fantastic. This has been such a good conversation. And thank you to
Thank you.
everyone for listening along at home. That's it for this episode of Life at Leyton podcast. We'll be back in a little while with the next episode.